The morning Martha Hayes buried her father, she swore over his grave that she would not rest until the men who murdered him were dead or dragged before a judge. And 3 weeks later, alone in the high red rocks above the Gila River, she was still keeping that promise when a stranger's rifle clicked behind her ear. It was the spring of 1878, and the Arizona Territory was still a raw and unclaimed thing, full of cattle trails and dry washes and towns that sprang up around a well or a stage stop and called themselves permanent. Willow Creek was one such town, a scattering of clapboard buildings and a single dusty street pressed between the river and the foothills of the Mazatzel Mountains. It was there that Elias Hayes had built his ranch 20 years before, back when the land was cheap and the water rights were his simply because no one else wanted them badly enough to fight for them. It was there that his daughter Martha had grown up learning to rope a steer and shoot a rifle and read her Bible by lamplight. And it was there, on a night in early April, that 4 men rode onto Hayes' land, shot her father through the chest, and put a bullet in her younger brother Daniel when he ran out of the house with nothing but a shotgun and 18 years of courage. Martha had not been rescued that night, because there had been no one to do the rescuing. She had held her father's head in her lap while the blood went black in the dirt, and she had closed her brother's eyes herself, and she had buried them both beneath the cottonwood tree her mother had planted before dying of fever a decade earlier. The men who did it, she came to learn from a terrified drifter who had seen them ride through afterward bragging over whiskey, worked for a land speculator named Silas Rourke, who wanted the Hayes water rights for a mining venture he was building upriver, and who had decided that an old man and his children were an obstacle more easily removed than negotiated with. The law in that part of the territory was thin as a whisper. Marshall Boone in Willow Creek was an honest man, but he was one man with a badge and a bad hip, and Rourke had money enough to buy silence from the territorial officials in Prescott. Martha understood, in the raw days after the funeral, that if she waited for justice to come to her, she would wait until she was an old woman, if Rourke did not have her killed first for knowing what she knew. So she sold 2 horses, packed her father's old Henry rifle and a Colt revolver that had belonged to her brother, and rode out into the badlands after the men who had taken everything from her. She had been gone 11 days when her aunt, a widow named Constance Whitfield who lived in Tucson, grew frantic enough to hire a bounty hunter to find her, believing her niece to be a grieving, foolish girl who would get herself killed wandering the desert alone. The man Constance hired was named Timothy Hadley, and he was, at 31 years old, already known through 3 territories as a man who found what he was paid to find, and who did it without unnecessary violence, which in that country was a rarer virtue than most men supposed. Timothy Hadley had not always hunted men for money. He had once been a rancher's son in West Texas, the eldest of 2 brothers, and he had watched his younger brother Caleb die in a raid when Timothy was 22, and away buying cattle in Fort Worth, arriving home 2 days too late to do anything but dig a grave. He had spent the years since chasing outlaws across half the West, telling himself it was a living, though anyone who looked at his eyes when he spoke of it could see it was something closer to penance. He was not a cruel man. He carried his guilt quietly, the way some men carry a Bible, close to the chest and rarely opened for others to see. He found Martha's trail easily enough, for she was riding hard and careless in her grief, and he caught up to her on the 12th day in a narrow canyon above the Gila, where she had stopped to water her horse and study the ground for tracks. He came up behind her without meaning to startle her so badly, his rifle lowered but visible, and when she spun with her brother's Colt already drawn and leveled at his chest, he found himself looking into a pair of gray eyes that held no fear at all, only a fury banked low and steady like a coal that had been burning a long time. "You are a long way from anywhere a woman ought to be traveling alone," he said, keeping his voice even, the way he had learned to speak to spooked horses and desperate men. "I am exactly where I mean to be," Martha answered, And you can lower that rifle, mister, because I have already shot one man dead this week, and I find I do not mind the notion of a second. That was, in fact, true, though she did not explain further just then. 3 days earlier she had come upon one of Rourke's men alone at a line shack, a lean, cruel-faced rider named Prout who had been at her family's ranch that night. And when he had gone for his gun rather than surrender, she had put a bullet through him without hesitation, without regret, and had ridden on afterward feeling nothing but a grim and unfamiliar clarity. She had learned in that moment that she was capable of more than anyone in Willow Creek had ever imagined of her, least of all herself. Timothy studied her for a long moment, the rifle still in his hands but pointed now at the ground. He had met his share of grieving women before, sisters and wives and mothers who wanted their men brought home, and he had learned to read the particular shape of sorrow on a person's face. What he saw on Martha Hayes was not the soft, pleading grief of someone waiting to be saved. It was something harder, forged. "Your aunt hired me to bring you home," he said. "Constance Whitfield. She is worried sick you will end up dead in a wash somewhere, and if you keep riding the way you have been, she may be right. My aunt does not understand what happened to my father and my brother," Martha said, "and I do not need bringing home. I have no home left to go to that matters, not while Silas Rourke draws breath and walks free in this territory." She lowered the Colt slightly, though she did not holster it. "I don't need a rescue, Mr. Hadley. I need a reckoning. There is a difference, and I would thank you to understand it before you try to sling me over your saddle like a sack of flour and haul me back to town." The word reckoning struck something in him, some old chord he had not heard plucked in years, not since he himself had ridden out after his brother's killers with nothing but a borrowed pistol and a boy's blind fury. He remembered how it had felt to want justice so badly that the wanting became a kind of hunger in the chest, how no amount of comfort from well-meaning relatives could touch it. He remembered, too, how close he had come to dying for that hunger before an older bounty hunter had taken him in hand and taught him to do the thing properly instead of getting himself killed doing it badly. He looked at her a long moment, at the dust on her split skirt and the sunburn across her cheekbones and the steadiness of her hand on the pistol grip, and he made a decision that would have surprised every man who had ever hired him. He reached into his saddlebag, drew out a second revolver, an old but well-kept peacemaker he carried for spare, and held it out to her, grip first. "If you are set on this," he said, "then you had better carry a gun that will not misfire on you when the moment comes. That Colt of your brother's has a worn hammer spring. I noticed it when you drew on me. It will get you killed at the wrong second." Martha stared at the offered pistol, and then at his face, searching it for some trick, some lawman's trap dressed up as kindness. She found none. What she found instead was a kind of recognition, the look of a man who had stood exactly where she stood now and had not forgotten the ground beneath his feet. "You are not going to try to drag me back to Willow Creek," she said slowly. "I am going to help you finish what you started," Timothy said. "Because I do not think you will live to see Rourke brought down if you keep going at it alone and half mad with grief, and because I have some notion of what you are carrying, since I have carried a piece of it myself." He paused. "But we will do it my way, or as near to my way as your temper allows, because reckless does not mean brave, and I have buried enough people in this line of work who confuse the two." She took the gun from his hand. It was heavier than her brother's Colt, better balanced, and it fit her palm the way a good tool fits a workman's hand. "All right, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Tell me your way, then." That was the beginning of it, though neither of them called it a beginning at the time. They made camp together that night in the canyon, a fire kept small and hooded against the rocks so it would not carry light far, and over a supper of hardtack and dried beef, Martha told him the whole of it, the raid on the ranch, her father's last breath, her brother's body cooling in the yard, the drifter's confession about Rourke's ambitions for the water rights. Timothy listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her, in a voice roughened by old memory, about his own brother Caleb, about the raid he had come home 2 days too late to prevent, about the years of hunting men that had followed, not always for money, though money was what kept him fed. "I used to think if I caught enough of them," he admitted, staring into the low flames, "it would feel like it evened something out. It never has, not once. There is no scale in this world that balances a life lost against a life taken, not in gold, not in blood, not in years." "Then why do you keep doing it?" Martha asked. "Because the alternative is to let men like Rourke believe they can do as they please and no one will ever come," Timothy said. "That is not justice, maybe, not the kind they teach about in church, but it is something. It is a line drawn in the dirt that says this far and no further." He glanced at her across the fire. "You are drawing that same line, Miss Hayes. I recognized it the moment you turned that pistol on me instead of screaming for help." Martha found, to her own surprise, that she believed him, and more than that, she found she was grateful for the company, though she would not have admitted such a thing aloud that first night, not when her grief still sat so raw and close to the surface. She had expected, when she rode out from Willow Creek, to do this thing entirely alone, to carry the whole weight of it on her own shoulders because there was no one left who understood. And here, in the unlikeliest of places, was a stranger who understood entirely too well. They rode together for 4 more days after that, tracking the movements of Rourke's remaining men through the dry country between the Gila and the mining camp Rourke was building at a place called Copper Bend, high in a fold of the mountains, where a vein of ore had been discovered the year before. Timothy taught her things along the way, not because she needed teaching in courage, which she had in abundance, but in the small, precise skills that kept a person alive in dangerous work. How to read the wind before a shot, how to move quietly across loose scree, how to judge the distance a bullet would carry accurately at dusk when shadows played tricks on the eye. Martha, in turn, taught him things about the land itself, for she had grown up in that country and knew where the water could be found in dry seasons, which canyons flooded without warning after a storm in the high peaks, which mesas offered a clear line of sight over the trails below. It was on the third of those days, while they sat resting the horses in the shade of a rock overhang during the worst heat of the afternoon, that Martha asked him the question that had been sitting in her chest since the first night. "Why did you give me the gun?" she asked. "Any other man would have tried to talk me out of this, or tied me over a saddle and hauled me home whether I wished it or not. Why hand a grieving woman a loaded revolver and tell her to go on with her reckoning?" Timothy considered the question a long moment before answering, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Because I have seen what happens to a person's soul when someone takes their fight away from them out of a mistaken kindness," he said. "My mother tried to keep me from going after Caleb's killers. She meant well. She was afraid of losing her other son too. But taking that fight from me would not have healed the wound. It would only have festered it, turned it into something bitter that never had a chance to close properly." He looked at her directly then, his eyes dark and steady beneath the brim of his hat. "You are not some fragile thing that needs saving from your own grief, Martha Hayes. You are a woman who has been wronged clean through to the bone, and you have every right in this world to see it set right with your own hands, if that is what will let you sleep again. All I can do is see that you live long enough to do it properly." It was the first time he had called her by her given name instead of Miss Hayes, and something in the way he said it, gently, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth, made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief at all. "Timothy," she said, testing his name in return, and found that she liked the sound of it as well. They rode on, and the days between them grew easier, the silences less careful, the conversations less guarded. Martha found herself watching the way he sat his horse, easy and unhurried even on the roughest ground, the way he checked his weapons each evening with a methodical care that spoke of long habit, the way he was gentle with his mare, a chestnut named Ruth, in a manner that seemed at odds with his reputation as a hard man who hunted other men for coin. Timothy found himself watching Martha in turn, the fierce set of her jaw when she spoke of her father, the surprising softness that crept into her voice when she spoke of her mother's grave beneath the cottonwood, the way she laughed, rare and startled, when his mare nipped playfully at his hat one evening and sent it tumbling into the campfire ashes. On the fifth night, camped in a hollow beneath a ridge that overlooked the approach to Copper Bend, they sat close together against the cold, sharing a single blanket against the mountain chill. And Martha found herself speaking of things she had not spoken of since her mother died, of the small, ordinary joys of her childhood, of learning to bake bread badly and improving slowly under her mother's patient hand, of racing her brother Daniel across the north pasture on ponies too small for either of them, of the particular quality of light on the Hayes ranch at sunset, gold and endless, that she feared she would never see the same way again now that her father and brother were buried beneath. "I am sorry," Timothy said quietly when she had finished, "for all of it, your father, your brother, your mother before them. No one should have to bury so much family before they have had the chance to build one of their own." Martha looked at him in the low firelight, at the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of a decade of hard riding and harder losses, and she found herself asking a question she had not planned to ask. "Have you ever thought of building one? A family, I mean. You cannot hunt men forever, surely." Timothy was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was rough with something that might have been longing kept too long unspoken. "I used to think there was no room in a life like mine for that kind of thing," he said. "A man cannot ask a woman to wait at home wondering if he will come back from the next chase with a bullet in him. It did not seem fair to bring anyone into that uncertainty." He glanced at her, and something in his expression shifted, opened, in a way she had not seen from him before. "But I find myself thinking differently of late. I find myself thinking that maybe the right person would not need protecting from that uncertainty at all. Maybe the right person would simply understand it, because she was carrying the same fire herself." Martha's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling low between them, the vast dark sky wheeling overhead thick with more stars than either of them could count. She was aware, with sudden and startling clarity, of how close he sat beside her, of the warmth of him beneath the shared blanket, of the steady sound of his breathing. "Timothy," she said softly, "I did not come out here looking for anything but justice. I want you to know that. But I find I am glad, more glad than I can rightly explain, that it was you who found me on that canyon trail and not some other man who would have thrown me over his saddle and never once thought to ask what I needed instead." "I am glad of it too," Timothy said, and then slowly, as though giving her every chance to pull away, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her sun-browned skin. "I do not know what comes after this, Martha. I do not know if a man like me, with the life I have led, has any right to ask for more than this moment beneath these stars. But I know that I have not felt this steady, this certain of anything, in more years than I care to count, and I believe that has everything to do with you." She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, and when he bent his head slowly toward hers, she met him the rest of the way, and their first kiss was slow and searching and tasted faintly of wood smoke and the cold mountain night, and it settled something in both of their chests that had been unsettled for a very long time. They did not speak of it further that night, content instead to sit close beneath the blanket and watch the fire burn down to embers. But something had shifted between them, something neither grief nor vengeance could undo. And when they rode on toward Copper Bend the next morning, they rode a little closer together than they had before, their horses' shoulders nearly touching on the narrow trail. Copper Bend, when they finally came within sight of it 2 days later, was a raw scar on the mountainside. A cluster of tents and half-built timber structures clustered around the mouth of a new mine shaft, with Rourke's men, perhaps a dozen of them by Martha's count, moving between the buildings with the easy confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable in that remote country. "Silas Rourke himself," Timothy explained after a day of careful watching from a ridge above the camp, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who dressed like a banker even in the wilderness, fond of fine boots and a gold watch chain. A man who had made his fortune buying up water rights and mineral claims across 3 territories through a mixture of legal maneuvering, and where the law proved insufficient, outright murder. "We cannot simply ride down there with 2 guns between us and expect to walk out again," Timothy said, as they crouched together behind a boulder studying the camp through his field glasses. "There are too many of them, and Rourke will have men posted who know how to use a rifle. We need to be smarter than that." "Then how do we do it?" Martha asked. "I did not come this far to turn back now, Timothy." "I am not saying turn back," he said. "I am saying we need Marshal Boone, and we need a plan that does not end with both of us shot dead in the dirt before Rourke ever sees a judge." He lowered the glasses and looked at her, his expression serious. "I know a federal deputy marshal stationed in Prescott who has been building a case against Rourke's land dealings for months. A man named Hollies who has not been able to get enough evidence to move against him, because Rourke's money reaches into every corner of this territory's legal machinery. If we can get proof of what happened at your father's ranch, proof that ties Rourke directly to the murders, we can bring the law down on him properly in a way that will hold, instead of just trading one act of violence for another." Martha's jaw tightened. "And if the law fails again, the way it failed my father?" "Then we will have exhausted every honest path first," Timothy said gently. "And you will know, whatever happens after, that you did not become the kind of person Rourke is. That matters, Martha. I have seen good people lose themselves chasing vengeance until they could not tell the difference anymore between justice and simple killing. I do not want that for you." It was not the answer of a man trying to steal her fight away from her, she realized, but the answer of a man who wanted her to win it and still recognize herself afterward. And for that she found herself trusting him more completely than she had trusted anyone since her father died. They spent 2 more days gathering what evidence they could, moving carefully around the edges of the camp under cover of darkness, and on the second night they had a stroke of fortune neither had expected. A young miner named Coy Whitaker, no older than 19, was caught by Timothy slipping away from the camp under cover of dark, clearly deserting, and rather than fight, the frightened young man begged not to be shot, explaining in a rush of words that he had been hired on to dig ore and had not known, when he signed on, that Rourke's foreman Bragg had been the one to lead the raid on the Hayes ranch, nor that 2 other men who had ridden with them that night, a pair of brothers named Cutter, were still camped not 200 yards away, boasting drunkenly most nights about the old rancher and his boy they had put down like dogs. Coy Whitaker, terrified and eager to avoid a bounty hunter's bullet, agreed readily to give a signed statement to a federal marshal describing what he had heard, and further agreed to lead Timothy and Martha to a strongbox in Bragg's tent, where Rourke's foreman was known to keep correspondence, believing it safer under lock than in Rourke's own quarters where any competitor might think to search. That night, while the camp slept off a payday's worth of whiskey, Martha and Timothy moved together through the dark rows of tents, Martha's heart hammering not with fear but with a fierce and focused purpose, until they reached Bragg's tent and found, exactly as Coy had promised, a strongbox that Timothy forced open with a thin blade in a matter of minutes. Inside were letters, in Rourke's own hand, instructing Bragg in coded but unmistakable language to remove certain obstacles to the Copper Bend water claim, dated only 3 days before the raid on the Hayes ranch, along with a ledger recording a payment to Bragg and his men the week following, described only as a bonus for expedited land clearance, but damning enough, Timothy assured her, to hang the case together once laid before a judge alongside Coy Whitaker's testimony. They were nearly clear of the camp, the letters folded safe inside Timothy's coat, when a dog began barking near the mess tent, and a moment later a man's voice called out into the dark, sharp with suspicion, and lantern light began to bloom between the tents as Rourke's men roused themselves to investigate. "Run," Timothy whispered, and they ran, low and fast between the shadows of the tents, back toward the ridge where their horses waited hobbled in a stand of pine. But they had gone barely 50 yards when a shot cracked through the dark, and a man's shout went up behind them, and Martha felt the wind of a bullet pass close enough to stir her hair. She did not freeze. She had learned, in the weeks since her father's death, that fear was a thing that could be used rather than surrendered to. And she turned, dropped to one knee behind a water trough, and returned fire with the peacemaker Timothy had given her, driving back the two men who had come charging after them long enough for Timothy to reach the horses and bring hers up at a run. "Now, Martha, ride," he called, and she swung up into the saddle even as more shots cracked behind them, and together they thundered down the ridge trail into the darkness, bullets chasing sparks off the rocks around them, until the sounds of pursuit fell away behind the twisting canyons, and they finally slowed their horses to catch their breath beneath the cold light of a rising moon. "That was close," Martha breathed, her hands still trembling faintly on the reins, though her voice held more exhilaration than fear. "Too close," Timothy said, but when he looked at her, there was something like pride in his expression, along with the sharp fear of a man who has come near to losing something he has only just found. "You did not flinch back there. Most men I have ridden with would have frozen." "I did not have the luxury of flinching," Martha said. "Not with everything I have left riding on getting those letters to your martial friend." They rode through the remainder of the night and reached Willow Creek by mid-morning, exhausted and dust-caked but triumphant. And from there, Timothy sent word by the fastest rider in town to Deputy Marshal Hollis in Prescott, describing what they had found and requesting he come at once with sufficient men to make an arrest that would hold. It would take 4 days for Hollis to arrive, days that Martha and Timothy spent uneasily in Willow Creek, aware that Rourke, once he discovered his strongbox rifled and his foreman's letters missing, would move quickly either to destroy further evidence or to silence anyone who might testify against him, including a certain young miner named Coy Whitaker who had fled with them and now sat nervously in Marshal Boone's jail for his own protection, and including, Timothy feared most of all, Martha herself. His fear proved well-founded. On the third night, as Martha sat with her Aunt Constance in the small parlor of Constance's house at the edge of town, going over for the 10th time the letters they had recovered, a rock came through the front window trailing a burning rag, and within moments flames were licking up the parlor curtains, while a rider outside fired 2 shots into the air and shouted for the whole street to hear that Silas Rourke sent his regards to any woman who thought herself clever enough to meddle in his business. Timothy, who had been keeping watch from the boardwalk across the street precisely because he had anticipated something of the sort, was already running before the second shot faded, and he reached the house in time to help Constance and Martha beat out the flames with wet blankets before the whole structure caught, and to exchange fire with the retreating rider, though the man escaped into the darkness before Timothy could bring him down. "That settles it," Marshal Boone said grimly, arriving on the scene with his rifle in hand and his bad hip forgotten in his hurry. "Rourke has declared open war on this town. We cannot wait 4 more days for Hollis. I am deputizing every able man in Willow Creek who will stand with us, and we are going to end this before he burns the whole street down around our ears." Martha, soot-streaked and furious but unhurt, stepped forward before Timothy could speak. "I am not staying behind for this, Marshal. This began with my father's murder, and I mean to see the end of it with my own eyes, whatever that end looks like." Marshal Boone looked as though he wished to argue, but a glance at Timothy's face and at the set of Martha's jaw told him it would be wasted breath. "Then God help us all," he muttered, and set about organizing the dozen townsmen willing to ride with him. Rourke, when word reached him through a fast rider that his attack on the Whitfield house had failed, and that Marshal Boone was raising a posse, made the decision that would prove his undoing. Rather than flee, as a more cautious man might have done, he gathered his remaining men, some 8 or 9 hardened riders left after the desertions and the losses of recent days, and rode down from Copper Bend toward Willow Creek itself, intending, Timothy guessed, to make an example of the town that had dared to defy him, to burn what remained of the Hayes name from the territory once and for all before any federal marshal could arrive to complicate matters. The two forces met at dawn on the fourth day, on the open flat ground a mile outside Willow Creek, where the road from the mountains crossed the shallow ford of the Gila River. Rurke's riders coming down from the north in a hard column of dust, Marshal Boone's posse spread in a defensive line along the riverbank, with what cover the cottonwoods and rocks afforded them. Martha sat her horse near the center of that line, the peacemaker steady in her hand, Timothy close beside her, and when Rurke himself rode forward under a scrap of white cloth tied to a rifle barrel, calling out that he would spare the town if the woman Hayes and the bounty hunter were handed over to him, it was Martha who answered, her voice carrying clear and unafraid across the ford. "I am the woman you are looking for, Silas Rurke," she called out. "I am Martha Hayes, daughter of Elias Hayes, whom your men murdered in his own yard while I held him dying in my arms. I am not hiding from you, and I am not asking anyone else to fight my battle. If you want a reckoning, come and take it, but know that I have earned the right to give you one in return." Rurke's heavy face twisted with something between contempt and unease, unused as he was to being addressed so directly by anyone, let alone a woman he had expected to find cowering. "You are a fool, girl," he shouted back. "This is a man's business, land and water and the law of profit, and you would have done better to stay a grieving widow's niece and let it be." "My father built that ranch with his own 2 hands," Martha answered, "and my brother died defending it at 18 years old, and there is no amount of gold or profit that gives you the right to have taken either of them from me. You will answer for what you did, Mr. Rurke, one way or another this morning." It was Rurke who fired first, perhaps sensing that words would not carry the day for him, and the battle that followed was brief and brutal but mercifully short, for Marshal Boone's men, though fewer, were fighting on ground they knew and defending a town they loved, while Rurke's riders, mercenaries and hired guns for the most part, had little loyalty to a cause beyond their pay and broke quickly once 2 of their number fell in the opening exchange of fire. Timothy fought beside Martha through it, covering her when she needed covering, trusting her aim when the moment called for trust rather than protection, and it was in the chaos of that final skirmish, as Rurke himself tried to break away eastward along the riverbank, that Martha spurred her horse after him alone, unwilling to let him escape into the confusion and vanish to buy his way free of justice, as he had bought his way free of it so many times before. She caught him at the ford itself, his horse stumbling in the shallow water, and when he turned with his pistol raised, she was already there, her own gun steady on him, close enough now that neither of them could miss. "Go on then," Rurke snarled, water dripping from his coat, his composure entirely gone now, replaced by something desperate and ugly. "Shoot me, girl, if you have the stomach for it. Prove you are no better than the men you claim to hate." Martha's finger tightened on the trigger, and for one long moment, with the whole weight of her father's death and her brother's death and every mile of that desperate ride pressing behind her eyes, she wanted nothing in this world so much as to end it there in the shallow water and be done with it forever. And then she thought of Timothy's words beside the fire, of not wanting to lose herself the way Rurke had lost himself, of the difference between justice and simple killing, and she understood, with a clarity that steadied her hand rather than weakening it, exactly what kind of reckoning she wanted, and it was not a bullet in a man already broken and cornered. "No," she said, lowering the gun's aim just enough to hold him at bay rather than end him outright. "I am not going to shoot you, Silas Rurke, though God knows you have earned it 10 times over. I am going to see you stand before Deputy Marshal Hollis and answer for every letter in that strongbox, for every man you paid to murder, and I am going to watch you dragged off to prison in chains. And that, Mr. Rurke, is a far worse fate for a man like you than a quick death in a river you can no longer even claim to own. You wanted profit above all things. You will lose every dollar of it now, and your name besides, and you will spend whatever years remain to you knowing that a girl you called a fool is the reason for it." Rourke's face crumpled, not with relief but with a kind of hollow fury at being denied even the dignity of a dramatic end. And it was in that moment of his distraction that Timothy arrived, riding hard along the bank, and disarmed him with a single efficient motion, wresting the pistol from Rourke's hand and shoving him face down into the shallow water before hauling him up, dripping and cursing, to be bound with rope brought quickly by two of Marshal Boone's men. The battle was over within minutes after that. The remaining riders of Rourke's crew either fled or surrendered, and Willow Creek stood, scorched at its edges but whole, its people gathering slowly along the riverbank to see the man who had terrorized them for so long led away in chains toward Marshal Boone's jail. Deputy Marshal Hollis arrived 2 days later than planned, having ridden hard once word of the battle reached Prescott, and found the case already largely made for him. Rourke in custody, Coy Whittaker's sworn statement in hand, the letters and ledger recovered from Bragg's strongbox laid out as evidence, and Bragg himself, along with the surviving Cutter brother, both captured in the aftermath and eager enough to confess their part in the Hayes Ranch murders in exchange for whatever leniency they might buy themselves. Rourke, Bragg, and the Cutter brother were all bound over for trial in the territorial court at Prescott, and though it would take the better part of a year for the legal machinery to grind through to its conclusion, Rourke was ultimately convicted of murder and conspiracy and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out the following spring, while Bragg and Cutter received long terms in the territorial prison. Martha did not attend the hanging when it finally came. She had by then found that she no longer needed to see it with her own eyes to know that the reckoning she had sought was complete, that her father and brother's deaths had been answered in the way the law was meant to answer them, properly, publicly, beyond any doubt, and that she herself had not needed to become the kind of person who took a life in cold blood to achieve it. That knowledge, she told Timothy on the evening the news of the conviction reached Willow Creek, mattered to her more than she could easily explain, and she was grateful, more grateful than words could carry, that he had understood that need in her from the very first night beside the canyon fire, and had helped her walk the harder, slower, truer path to justice instead of the quicker and more terrible one. In the weeks following the battle at the ford, while the legal proceedings against Rourke and his men wound their slow course through the territorial courts, Timothy Hadley found himself with little reason to leave Willow Creek. His work as a bounty hunter had, in truth, always been solitary work, chasing men across long distances for pay and moving on again before any place could feel like more than a stopping point. But something in the weeks he had spent riding beside Martha Hayes had unsettled that old restlessness in him, replaced it with a wish to stay, to see what kind of life might grow in a place where he had, for the first time in nearly a decade, felt something like belonging. He took a room above the Mercantile on Willow Creek's Main Street and told himself it was only until the trial concluded and his testimony was no longer needed. But the weeks stretched into a month, and then 2, and he found reasons to remain that had less to do with legal proceedings and everything to do with the woman who had begun, without quite meaning to occupy every corner of his thoughts. Martha, for her part, was rebuilding what she could of her father's ranch, with the help of her Aunt Constance and a handful of neighbors who had known Elias Hayes as an honest and generous man, and were glad to see his daughter carry his memory forward rather than abandon the land to ruin. Timothy found himself drawn out to the ranch nearly every day, first with excuses of helping repair a fence or mend a roof damaged in the previous winter's storms, and then, as the excuses grew thinner and less necessary, simply because he wished to be near her. It was on an evening in early June, the two of them sitting together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun go down gold and endless over the north pasture, exactly as Martha had once described it beside their canyon fire, that Timothy finally spoke the thing that had been building in his chest since that first kiss beneath the mountain stars. "Martha," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands in the manner she had come to recognize as a sign of some deeper nervousness beneath his usually steady composure. "I have spent 10 years of my life moving from one town to the next, never staying long enough anywhere to plant so much as a fence post, because I did not believe there was any place in this world that wanted me to stay, nor anyone in it who might wish it either. I find, since the day I rode into that canyon and found you standing your ground with your brother's Colt drawn on me, that I no longer believe that. I find I do not wish to move on from Willow Creek at all. I find I do not wish to move on from you." Martha turned to look at him, her heart beating fast in her chest, though she had in truth been waiting for some version of these words for weeks, hoping for them with a hope she had been almost afraid to name even to herself. "Then don't," she said simply. "Move on, I mean. Stay, Timothy. Stay here with me, and help me build something out of all this wreckage that is not just grief and reckoning but something good besides. I do not think I could bear to watch you ride away now, not after everything, not after what you have given me these past months, which is more than a rescue and more than justice both. You gave me back the belief that I was not alone in the world, and I do not know how a person is meant to simply watch that ride off into the sunset and call it a fond memory." Timothy reached across the small distance between them and took her hand in both of his calloused fingers gentle around hers exactly as they had been that first night beneath the stars. "Martha Hayes," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "I have hunted men across 3 territories and never once felt as certain of anything as I feel certain of this. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since that first night in the canyon when you turned that pistol on me and I saw, instead of fear, a fire that matched my own. I would be honored, more honored than I have any right to be, if you would consent to be my wife." Martha's eyes filled with tears, though they were tears of a different kind than any she had shed since her father's death, warm and full and entirely without sorrow, and she answered him not with words at first but by leaning forward and kissing him there on the porch in the fading gold light, long and slow and certain, before finally drawing back enough to speak. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Timothy Hadley, I will marry you, and gladly, and I will thank God every day of my life that it was you who rode into that canyon, and not some other man entirely, because I do not think any other man in this territory would have thought to hand a grieving woman a loaded gun instead of a handkerchief, and I have come to believe that was the wisest and kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." They were married that September, in the small white-steepled church in Willow Creek that had stood since the town's earliest days, with Marshall Boone standing as Timothy's witness and Constance Whitfield weeping happy tears in the front pew, and half the town turning out afterward for a wedding supper on the ranch that Martha's father had built, laid out on long tables beneath the very cottonwood tree where Elias and Daniel Hayes lay buried, so that it felt, to Martha, as though her father and brother were somehow present after all, blessing the union from wherever they now rested. Timothy hung up his bounty hunter's saddlebags for good that autumn, taking instead to the work of rebuilding the Hayes ranch alongside his new wife, mending fences, restoring the herd that had scattered in the chaos following Elias Hayes's death, and turning what had been a place of tragedy back into a place of living, working, hopeful industry. He proved, to the considerable surprise of no one who had watched him during those months of courtship, to be as steady and capable a rancher as he had been a hunter of men, and within 2 years, the Hayes Ranch, now spoken of by the neighbors as the Hadley Ranch, though Martha insisted on keeping her father's name carved into the gate posts alongside her husband's, had become one of the most prosperous spreads along that stretch of the Gila. Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years to the day after Timothy had first found Martha in that canyon above the river, and they named him Elias, after her father, a strong and healthy boy with his mother's steady gray eyes and his father's quiet watchfulness. 2 years after that came a daughter, whom they named Caroline after Martha's own long-dead mother, a bright and curious child who grew up chasing chickens across the yard and demanding, from the earliest age she could form the words, to be taught to ride exactly as her mother had been taught by her own father before her. A third child followed some years later, another son, whom they named Caleb, after the brother Timothy had lost so many years before in West Texas. A quiet acknowledgement, spoken between husband and wife alone one evening on that same porch where he had first asked for her hand, that all the old griefs of their separate pasts had at last found some measure of peace in the family they had built together. Willow Creek itself grew and changed in the years that followed, as towns across the Arizona Territory did in that era, the mining interests eventually settling into more orderly and lawful operation once Rourke's corrupt influence had been broken, the territorial courts growing steadier and more reliable as the years passed, and statehood, though still decades distant, began to seem a plausible eventual future rather than a distant dream. Marshall Boone served the town faithfully for another decade before retiring to a small house near the church, and Constance Whitfield lived long enough to see all three of Martha and Timothy's children grown nearly to adulthood, delighting in each of them as though they were her own. Martha never forgot her father and brother, never stopped visiting their graves beneath the cottonwood tree on the anniversary of the raid each spring. But the sharp edge of that old grief softened over the years into something gentler, a quiet gratitude for the men they had been rather than a raw wound demanding constant tending, and she came to understand, as the seasons passed and her own children grew tall and strong around her, that the reckoning she had sought that terrible spring had given her exactly what justice was meant to give the wronged, not vengeance, which curdles in the heart of whoever carries it, but the freedom to grieve fully and then, at last, to live. She would sometimes tell her children, when they were old enough to ask about the scar above her father's grave marker, or the old peacemaker revolver that hung, cleaned and oiled but unused, above the mantel in the ranch house parlor, the story of how their father had found her in a canyon above the Gila River, a grieving and furious young woman determined to hunt down the men who had murdered her family with nothing but her brother's worn-out Colt for protection. And how, instead of trying to talk her out of her purpose or drag her home against her will, he had simply handed her a better gun and asked to walk the road beside her. "Your father understood something most men in this territory never learned," she would tell them, sitting on that same porch in the long gold evenings of late summer, with Timothy beside her, his hair gone gray at the temples now, but his eyes still holding that same steady watchfulness she had first seen in him beside the canyon fire. He understood that love is not about deciding for someone else what they need. It is about asking them and then believing them when they answer and standing beside them however the answer comes. I told him I did not need rescuing. I needed a reckoning, and instead of arguing with me, he handed me the gun and he stayed. Timothy, listening to this telling for perhaps the 100th time over the years, would only smile and reach for his wife's hand, exactly as he had that first evening on this same porch, and say, as he always said, that it had been the easiest decision of his entire life, and the finest one besides, and that he would make the very same choice again without a moment's hesitation, in this life or any other, given the chance. Their son Elias grew up to take over management of the ranch in time, marrying a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and raising his own children beneath that same cottonwood tree, while Caroline, ever restless and curious, moved for a time to Tucson to train as a schoolteacher, before returning to Willow Creek to open the town's first proper schoolhouse, teaching 3 generations of ranch children their letters and sums in a building her father had helped construct with his own hands. Caleb, the youngest, took after his namesake uncle in temperament, quiet and thoughtful, and eventually became the town's respected doctor, having studied for several years in Tucson and returned to serve the very community that had once nearly burned in Silas Rourke's final, desperate act of violence. Martha Hayes Hadley lived to see her grandchildren grow tall in that same golden light she had once feared she would never see the same way again. And she often said, in her later years, that the greatest gift of her long life had not been the justice finally delivered against the men who murdered her father and brother, satisfying as that reckoning had ultimately been, but the unexpected love that had grown up alongside it, planted in the hard soil of grief and tended, against all reasonable expectation, into something that had lasted a lifetime and beyond. Timothy Hadley, for his part, never once regretted the bounty-hunting saddlebags he had hung up that autumn so many years before, nor the reputation he had once carried across 3 territories, for he had found, in the end, that the finest thing he had ever hunted was not a wanted man worth a bag of gold coin, but a grieving young woman with a worn-out Colt revolver and a fire in her eyes that matched his own, and that in choosing to hand her a gun instead of a rescue, he had found, without ever quite intending it, the reckoning of his own long and lonely years, settled at last in the steady, abiding peace of a home, a family, and a love that had grown, season after season, as deep and enduring as the cottonwood roots beneath which the whole story had first begun. And so it was that on the ranch where tragedy had once visited so cruelly, laughter came instead to live permanently in its place, children's voices calling across the same pastures where a grieving girl had once buried her father and brother. And every spring, when the cottonwood tree above their graves broke into new green leaf, the entire Hadley family would gather beneath it to remember, and to give thanks, and to carry forward into each new generation the hard-won understanding that Martha Hayes had first spoken to a stranger in a canyon above the Gila River, that love worth having does not rescue a person from their own strength, but stands beside it, offers what help it truly can, and trusts the person carrying the fire to know, in the end, exactly how far that fire needs to burn before it can finally, peacefully rest.